Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Tuesday, October 28th, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Dr. Volodymyr Dubovyk, who is director of the Center for International Studies at Menshikov National University in Odessa, Ukraine. Welcome, Professor. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you, Michael. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. To start off with, can we get some information on your educational and professional background?
Yes, of course. I'm an associate professor of international relations at the Odessa Meshnikov University and also director of the Center for International Studies at the same university. I'm also currently a senior fellow with the Center for European Policy Analysis based in Washington, D.C. I'm a non-resident fellow there.
So, to get right into it, how and why did you come to focus on U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Ukraine relations in particular?
It so happened that I was always interested in international relations and specifically the U.S. role in the world, even going back to my high school years. I was basically quite laser focused that I want to go and study international relations. But at that point of time, there was still Soviet Union. I entered in 1987 and been enrolled in the university, and there was no international relations, so I studied history. I studied contemporary history, but then we established the School of International Studies in Odessa University, and that was back in 1994. So ever since then, I was working there. I was always interested in the role that the U.S. has to play and how the discussion within the U.S. is usually taking place in terms of making decisions what to do next and how to apply U.S. potential. That was always of interest to me, the concepts, the conceptual background behind the decisions, and implementation as well, but primarily how people in U.S. and Washington in particular, how they come to conclusions that this or that thing should be done and why and how this enhances U.S. interests. So I just happen to be interested, and that reflects my research interest and also teaching interest because one of the courses that I teach is on U.S. foreign policy.
And what do you believe are the major challenges now in U.S. Ukraine relations, and how can they be overcome?
Well, the challenges are obvious. Ukraine is under very hard existential attack by Russian Empire, I would say, Russian Federation, but it's really imperialistic war. They're trying to grab some Ukrainian lands, but ultimately they're trying to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. And that's why everything that is helping us to withstand the pressure from Russia helps. And of course, the U.S. has a very special role, very specific role, because they have the money, they have the weapons, they have the diplomatic weight, the clout that they can use to help Ukraine. And there are some differences, obviously, in approach to the war of Russia against Ukraine between the previous and the current administration. But I believe that regardless of administration, there should be an understanding that supporting Ukraine is within U.S. national interests. If Ukraine is overwhelmed, God forbid, by Russia, then it would be a terrible news for not just Ukraine, but everyone in the region, everyone in Europe, for the entire European, Euro-Atlantic security, and ultimately very difficult moment for the U.S. Role in the world, which would be undermined severely. So that's why I believe that it is in U.S. interest, not just in terms of basically doing good thing and feeling sorry for Ukrainians and being horrified at what Russians do and horrified by war crimes, but in the sense of national interest, that it is within U.S. national interest to continue to help Ukraine. So we depend on weapons that are being supplied, we depend on intelligence sharing, we depend on diplomatic pressure on Russia that the U.S. is applying or not applying, or what kind of pressures they're applying. Therefore, the last step of introducing sanctions against two Russia's biggest oil producers, Rosneft and Lukoil, was clearly a step in the right direction, and we hope and expect that U.S. administration would follow in that manner.
Please comment on the meeting between U.S. President Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky that took place a little over 10 days ago on October 17th, 2025 at the White House in Washington, D.C.
I think it was a useful meeting, a useful conversation. I wouldn't say it was some kind of a flop, like some people reported that Ukraine didn't get what it wanted, because Ukraine obviously hoped that President Trump would announce the transfer of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. That didn't happen. President Trump apparently in the last moment decided that he's not going to do it, at least not going to do it now. He does not exclude the opportunity. He doesn't say that he's never going to do it. So he might down the road, but not right now. So Ukraine was a little disappointed with that. And also there was an announcement that soon, at some point, Trump will go to Budapest, Hungary. President Trump going to meet there President Putin. Later on we found out that maybe this meeting is not happening at all, or not happening anytime soon. It might still happen down the road again, but of course, Ukrainians were not necessarily happy about this direct meeting between Putin and Trump, because every time this meeting like this happens, it seems to be that Putin, being a very masterful manipulator and an old school KGB guy, he manages to somehow push his narratives and his views and his mindset to the counterpart in the conversation. So that's a problem for us every time it is, but it happens. But with Zelensky's meeting, I think it was okay. I think it was a very good conversation, all based on mutual respect. I think Zelensky and Trump has a long history between them. They have a long history. Initially, there was more maybe of wariness and maybe some lack of trust, but now I'm seeing more and more chemistry being built up in that relationship, and I think Zelensky now better understands President Trump, and I think now that President Trump also has more respect for Zelensky, and Zelensky stands not for his own personal interests, but he is really representing Ukrainians and national interests, and knows when when to say no, when to say yes, and he's flexible enough when it's possible, and he's inflexible when it's not possible. In the sense of defending Ukraine's national interests. And I think President Trump have come to appreciate and respect and understand the position of the Ukrainian side, and more disappointed with Russian side, because President Putin said on so many occasions to Mr. Trump that he is willing to end the war, but everything that Russia does points to the contrary, that there is no desire, no intention whatsoever on the Russia's part to finish this war, to end this war, in a meaningful way.
So, do you think this proposed Budapest summit will ever take place between President Trump and Russian President Putin? And if it does, do you think there's any value from a diplomatic standpoint for Ukraine?
Look, I mean, it might happen or not. If it happens, it's not the end of the world or great news either way, because it will be just one more contact. Because when President Trump met President Putin in Anchorage, most of us in Ukraine were not happy. But then again, a few days later, then he met actually Zelensky and a huge delegation of European leaders. And it was a very good conversation for Ukraine with President Trump. So there is some balancing here. There is some maneuvering. There is some attempt by current U.S. administration to actually continue to push the peace process forward. And for that, you need to balance, you need to maneuver, you need to use both carrots and sticks. I think enough carrots have been used because there were no major sanctions against Russia announced. But now it's time for sticks to be used, because clearly Putin only understands what we Ukrainians know for a long time, understands the language of strengths. If there is a language of weakness, if there is a language of timidity and decisiveness, he only uses this as an opportunity. He doubles down and he escalates. But when he is met with resolve, he actually tends to withdraw and sometimes make a step back and maybe realize that his war is not that easy to continue. So that's the point of the whole process. You help Ukraine with what you can, and you apply pressure on Putin. explaining to him that his war cannot be indefinite. He might not be able to ever win the war, and it costs him more and more and more. So you need to incur more costs on Russia for this imperialistic aggression against Ukraine. Otherwise, if you just appeal to Putin, please stop the war, come to your senses, it's not a good thing. He's not that kind of a guy who would ever really listen to this kind of appeals. He needs to be pushed to a certain point where he ultimately, hopefully, one day says, "Okay, let's sit down and let's have some real, meaningful negotiations."
Is the delivery of Tomahawk missiles from the U.S. critical to Ukraine's ongoing defense?
I would say that continuation of U.S. Assistance with weapons being sent to Ukraine is critical because U.S. just does have more stuff of that matter than Europeans do. There are some types of weapons that are basically unique and only being produced in U.S. So there are very few analogs produced by Europeans. I wouldn't focus exclusively on Tomahawks because we already received a lot of good stuff from U.S. and continue to receive it. Just recently, there's been a decision made to send us so-called ARM missiles, which are useful, and a good number also too, because with Tomahawks, we understand that Ukraine, even if the decision is made to give Tomahawks to Ukraine, Ukraine would not receive too many of those missiles, but with other missiles, we can probably get more and more or less similar results with using them against Russians. And also that the current administration is presumably, kind of easing a little bit the process of Ukrainians hitting Russian targets in Russia. Only the targets that have something to do with the war effort. So it could be oil refinery, it could be, a railroad hub or something like that. So we're not hitting any places where people actually live, where people reside. That's also, of course, a step forward. The current mechanism that U.S. are selling weapons, European allies of Ukraine are buying weapons and giving them to Ukraine is a good solution. I mean, given the current circumstances, and I think it's a good solution for all three parties involved. Americans get to actually not to spend their taxpayers' money on helping Ukraine, but doing the right thing by helping Ukraine. Europeans don't have enough weapons to give to Ukraine themselves, but they have some money on hand so they can use it. And Ukraine, either way, we are only interested in receiving the weapons. So whatever the formula is, we are interested in uninterrupted supply of weapons because unfortunately that's what it is. Whoever maybe in the West is saying stop giving Ukraine weapons because it prolongs the war, they don't know what they're talking about. Because if Ukraine is left out without any weapons, Russians would just push deeper into Ukraine and kill more Ukrainians and occupy more land and turn more and more millions of Ukrainians into the slaves. So, cutting supply of to Ukraine of weapons and humanitarian assistance would not shorten the war, but would actually maybe bring about the more dramatic and tragic end for the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian people. So obviously, we're not interested in that outcome.
Professor, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question. How successful has Ukraine been in its efforts to neutralize Russia's energy infrastructure? And on the opposite end, how successful has Russia been in its attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure?
Russia is very successful in its attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure because Ukraine's air defense is not strong enough. There have been efforts by our allies elsewhere in Europe, in the U.S., to provide us with some air defense systems, but it's not enough. Russia can attack from any direction, basically. Ukraine is a large country. It's the largest country in Europe, still is, if you don't count Russia. By purely European countries, it's the largest country. So it's very hard to defend a country like this against Russia, which is, asymmetric warfare. Russia is still stronger. They have upper hand. They have more weapons, more metal, as you said. They can throw it all on Ukraine. And unfortunately, they're able to produce more and more weapons as well, even now as we speak. So the problem is that some sanctions are not working and they're finding loopholes in sanctions and they're able to produce more weapons to kill more Ukrainians. So that's a huge problem. We're running against time here. But so therefore, yes, they can actually pretty much put Ukraine into darkness for the upcoming winter. And that's going to be bad news for Ukrainians, the citizens of Ukraine, residents of Ukraine. including families with children. Because of course it's not just even about darkness, it's about also heating, it's about water supply, it's about the phone. You wouldn't be able to charge your phone and stay in contact with your loved ones. So that's Russia is very successful in that respect. Ukraine badly needs more air defense systems. But what Ukraine is doing is also a very effective asymmetric warfare, like I said. If you're weaker, but you still find a way to hit hard and painfully, and that's what's happening with this oil refinery strikes. Not only it reminds Russians that they are in the war, they have the price to pay for that war, for their aggression against Ukraine. It also creates some tension between the population on one hand and the government on the other. Why can't you, defend us? Why can't you protect us? And inability to get the gas into your car. It's an unpleasant feeling in the war. And finally, shows that Ukraine is still fighting, still in a game. It's a long game. It's very difficult circumstances, dire circumstances for Ukraine, but we are managing to do it. And whatever number they have it, some say quarter, some say 30, some say up to 40% of Russian oil refineries are not working properly right now because of Ukraine strikes. It's a huge number, because it's a huge country, Russia, obviously. But we are managing to strike those targets, and even without the Western weapons. The current strikes against Russian targets in Russian territory are mostly done by Ukrainian missiles and Ukrainian drones. So therefore, what can you do? If you can't really win against Goliath with a sheer force, you use your brain, you use your creativity. That's what Ukrainians are doing, and doing quite successfully.
Professor Dubovyk, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
I have been speaking with Dr. Volodymyr Dubovyk, who is director of the Center for International Studies at Menshikov National University in Odessa, Ukraine. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.